In a quiet southern town where land still speaks louder than justice, Malcolm Hayes returned to bury his grandmother and found himself the target of a scheme generations in the making. The mayor and his deputies saw only a solitary black man, soft-spoken, outnumbered, and easy to push off the land. But Malcolm wasn't alone. His dog stood guard. His grandmother left him a trail of truth, and when they stepped onto his property and killed what he loved, they awakened something unshakable. What they thought was just a farm was a battlefield, and Malcolm was no longer asking to belong. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The first thing Malcolm Hayes noticed when he stepped out of his truck was the silence. Not the absence of sound, but the kind of deep, patient quiet that seemed to watch him more than surround him. The wind whispered through the bare pecan trees, and the sun hung low over the fields, casting long shadows that stretched toward the house like memories trying to touch him. The gravel beneath his boots shifted as he walked toward the front steps of the farmhouse, the same worn porch where his grandmother used to sit shelling peas, humming songs he never quite learned the words to. The funeral had ended hours ago, but the ache of it still clung to his clothes. Black suit, dusty shoes, a stiff knot in his throat that refused to loosen. The house stood just as she left it, white paint peeling at the corners, windows slightly fogged, a rocking chair motionless as if it had been waiting for her to return. He paused at the threshold, hand on the screen door, before pushing it open and stepping into the only place in the world that ever smelled like lemon balm and wood smoke at the same time. Inside, nothing had changed. A crocheted blanket folded neatly on the couch. Her Bible still open on the coffee table. Photographs lined the wall above the fireplace. Family members, some he remembered, most he didn't. All watching. He stood there for a moment, taking it in, the weight of inherited legacy settling on his shoulders like the heavy air before a storm. He had grown up visiting this place every summer, running barefoot through rows of okra and corn, swatting mosquitoes with a towel, and listening to Ruth Hayes tell stories about survival like they were fairy tales. Back then, he never understood why she was so serious about land. Now, walking through rooms still thick with her presence, he began to. Outside, the land sprawled in every direction, unbothered, untamed, and unmistakably hers. Low fences marked the property's edge, but the real borders were older, stitched into the soil by generations of sweat and care. A small pond glinted in the distance, and beyond it, a rusted tractor leaned into a copse of trees like it had grown tired of waiting to be used again. The barn sagged a little more than he remembered. Still, it stood. Malcolm walked the perimeter that afternoon, hands in his pockets, boots brushing fallen leaves and brittle stalks. A couple of pickup trucks passed slowly on the road out front, strangers behind the wheel, white faces turning to glance at him just long enough to send a message. One older man in a denim vest slowed his truck at the edge of the field, window down. "You the Hayes boy?" he asked, not unkindly, but not exactly warm either. Malcolm nodded. "Yes, sir. Lot of interest in this land lately. Could fetch a nice price." "I'm not looking to sell." The man gave a small shrug. "That's your call. Just be careful. Folks out here don't always appreciate what they don't understand." Then he drove off, leaving behind a trail of dust and something unspoken that lingered in the air long after the truck disappeared down the road. That night, Malcolm unpacked his suitcase and set up in the small bedroom that once belonged to his mother. The walls were lined with shelves of old seed catalogs, family albums, and jars of marbles his uncles had collected. The bed creaked under him as he sat down, the mattress softer than he remembered. On the nightstand, beneath a lace doily, was a sealed envelope. His name was written on the front in that neat, slanted cursive his grandmother never let time steal from her. He opened it slowly, the paper whispering as it unfolded. "My dearest Malcolm, if you're reading this, I'm already gone. I wish I could have told you more, but some things are better revealed in their own time. This land, our land, is more than soil and fences. It carries names they tried to erase. It holds stories they buried. You are the last of us to stand here, and that makes you the most important. Protect it, not just for me, but for all who came before. With love, always, Grandma Ruth." He read the letter twice, then once more in the silence, as the wind picked up and rattled the windows like it was testing his resolve. He folded it carefully, placed it in his wallet, and stood. He moved to the front door and stepped out onto the porch, looking out over the field, the moonlight brushing the crops like a hand through hair. He thought about the condo in the city he had just left behind, the engineering job he'd worked for nearly a decade, the friends who didn't understand why he kept calling this place home. But home wasn't something you chose, he realized. It chose you. And this land, this quiet, stubborn land, had chosen him long before he was ready. He wasn't leaving. Not now. Not ever. The town hall was held in the old courthouse, its bricks dulled by time and its wooden benches polished smooth by generations of restless hands. Malcolm arrived just before 6, dressed in a collared shirt and jeans, boots still dusted from the fields. He didn't expect much, just wanted to sit quietly, observe, maybe catch wind of anything related to zoning or property issues. He hadn't expected to see him. Mayor Howard Renshaw stood at the front of the chamber, shaking hands like he was handing out favors. His salt and pepper hair was combed back with a kind of practiced dignity, and his suit looked expensive in a way that felt performative. When his eyes landed on Malcolm, they stayed there just a second longer than necessary, calculating. He smiled as if he recognized an opportunity. "Mr. Hayes," Renshaw called from the front, voice smooth as syrup. "I'd been meaning to welcome you back. Ruth was a fine woman." Malcolm offered a polite nod as he made his way toward the side benches. "Appreciate that." The mayor stepped forward, hand outstretched. She was well respected around here, kept to herself, but strong-willed. Reminded me of my own grandmother. Rest her soul. Malcolm shook his hand, feeling the subtle grip. A little firmer than friendly, not quite aggressive. "She taught me everything I know about that land," Malcolm said. "Told me it was in the family for generations." Renshaw chuckled lightly. "Well, now it's yours. That's a big responsibility. Lot of folks wouldn't mind a piece of that soil, especially with development moving this way." "Yeah, I've heard," Malcolm replied, tone even. Before the mayor could respond, a door creaked open in the back. 2 deputies entered, tan uniforms crisp and untucked arrogance in their posture. One wore aviators indoors, the other chewed gum like he was timing it with a metronome. They didn't speak, just found a spot against the wall and leaned, watching, measuring. Deputy Carl Briggs, the one with the gum, eyed Malcolm with a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. Neil Foster, the taller one with the glasses, gave a small nod as if to say, "We see you now." Malcolm didn't flinch. He just returned the stare, then turned his attention back to the proceedings. Later, after the meeting ended, Malcolm stepped outside into the humid dusk. A few people filtered out behind him, murmuring among themselves. He leaned against the railing, taking in the buzz of insects and the faint scent of cigarette smoke. "Didn't think you'd show." The voice came from the side. An older black man in denim overalls and a straw hat stepped into view, leaning on a cane. His eyes were sharp, full of something watchful and unspoken. "Jeremiah Boone," the man said, extending a hand. "Used to farm the next plot over. Ruth and I talked most Sundays." Malcolm shook his hand. She mentioned you a few times. Jeremiah nodded slowly, then looked back toward the courthouse. You're gonna want to keep your eyes open, son. That land you're on? Some folks been circling it since the Reagan years. Ruth knew it. That's why she fought like she did. I'm not looking to sell, Malcolm said. That's good, Jeremiah said, though his voice carried a note of warning. But around here, not selling don't mean they stop asking. Means they start pushing. Malcolm didn't reply. He didn't have to. The next morning, the county code enforcement office left a yellow slip pinned to his fence gate. Notice of violation. Improper fencing height. Notice of violation. Unauthorized storage of rusted vehicles. Notice of violation. Overgrown vegetation near public access line. It read like a list written by someone who'd never been out to the farm themselves, or by someone who wanted to make life difficult, 1 inch at a time. He made the trip into town to dispute it, standing in line while the clerk behind the glass avoided eye contact. When he finally got to the counter, the woman gave him a tight smile and gestured toward a pamphlet. You can file a request for inspection, she said flatly. But there's a 3-week backlog. This says I have 10 days to fix it, Malcolm said, tapping the slip. Then I suggest you get started, she replied, already turning to the next person in line. Back home, he tossed the violation notice onto the kitchen table and stared at it in silence. His grandmother would have told him not to let them get under his skin. But this wasn't just a nuisance. It was a message. That night, he sat out on the back steps with his dog, Shep, a loyal mutt with golden eyes and ears that perked at every small sound. The dog leaned into him, resting its head on Malcolm's knee as the sun dipped behind the trees. He rubbed Shep's head slowly. You feel it too, don't you? The dog looked up at him with quiet certainty, then turned its gaze toward the darkening fields. Malcolm sat for a long time, watching the shadows stretch. The breeze rustled the branches above. Somewhere out there, past the rows of forgotten crops and dying fences, something had begun to stir. And it wasn't going to stop just because he wanted peace. He reached for the letter again in his back pocket, running a finger along the crease. He hadn't misread it. His grandmother had chosen him to fight, not just to inherit. They wanted his land, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. The rumble of diesel engines woke Malcolm before dawn. At first, he thought it was a delivery truck on the highway. But when he stepped onto the porch, coffee steaming in one hand, his jaw tightened at the sight of 2 white work trucks parked inside his fence line. Beyond the cattle gate like they owned the place. Men in neon vests moved with the casual arrogance of those who didn't expect to be questioned. They were hammering orange flags into the soil and setting up tripods in the soft morning light, as if it were just another job site. Malcolm's boots hit the dirt with purpose. His steps were slow, deliberate, controlled. You planning to ask before you start carving up my field? He called out. One of the men, mid-40s, sandy hair, with a clipboard tucked under his arm, turned lazily. His name tag read T. Barnes. We've got clearance to survey this parcel, he said without apology. Shouldn't take long. You'll hardly notice we were here. You're already noticed, Malcolm replied, voice low and sharp. Who gave you permission to be on this land? Barnes stepped closer, chin tilted just enough to signal he wasn't used to explaining himself. Renshaw Development. Said the property was already in negotiation. Well, they lied, Malcolm said, standing still. I own this land. It's not for sale. And you're trespassing. Barnes gave a tight, patronizing smile. Look, no need to get upset. We're just doing our job. Probably some paperwork misunderstanding. You people always jump to conclusions. Malcolm's expression didn't change, but the heat behind his eyes said more than words ever could. You people, he repeated, his voice deadly calm. Barnes raised his hands, mock innocent. Hey, relax. Nobody's trying to start trouble here. Another surveyor chuckled under his breath and muttered, "Whole place is a weed patch anyway." Malcolm turned toward him. "Say that louder." The man looked up, mouth half open, but Barnes stepped in quickly. All right, let's wrap it. Come on, fellas." They began packing up, slower than necessary, glancing back at Malcolm with smirks that hinted at everything they weren't saying aloud. Malcolm pulled out his phone and started filming. Every license plate, every face, every flag they had planted. "You recordin' me now?" Barnes asked with a mocking grin. "What is this? Some social media stunt?" "No," Malcolm said flatly. "It's called evidence." Barnes narrowed his eyes. "Careful what you play at, Hayes. This town's got a long memory." "Good," Malcolm said. "So do I." The trucks finally rolled out, their tires spinning up dirt as they peeled back onto the road. The orange flags still dotted his soil like scars. Malcolm walked through the rows, yanking them up one by one, the sharp plastic snapping in his grip. They weren't just testing him. They were marking territory. And now, he knew it. The county assessor's office was a place where time seemed to stretch unnaturally, each minute dragged down by the hum of old fluorescent lights and the shuffle of papers that moved more like burdens than documents. Malcolm stood in line for nearly 20 minutes, behind a woman disputing a tax penalty and an elderly man asking about a water line permit that hadn't been reviewed in 3 months. When it was finally his turn, he stepped forward with quiet composure, placing a well-organized folder on the counter in front of the clerk. A middle-aged man whose glasses slid perpetually down the bridge of his nose and whose expression gave the impression that helping people was a tolerated inconvenience. "I need to confirm the status of Parcel 2184, Malcolm said, keeping his voice measured and polite. "It's the property previously held by Ruth Hayes. The title transferred to me last month. I've got the deed, tax receipts, and survey map here." The clerk tapped into the system, his fingers pausing slightly as he read from the screen, his frown deepening as he scrolled. Parcel 2184, he muttered, clearly puzzled. "Looks like the file's been flagged. It's showing as under administrative review, but there's no owner currently listed in the database." Malcolm leaned slightly forward, his brow tightening. "That's not possible. The title's already transferred. Everything's been filed and recorded properly. It's in my name." The clerk didn't meet his eyes. Instead, he looked down at the folder, then back at the screen, then once more at Malcolm, as if searching for an exit in the conversation he now regretted having. "Could be a technical error. System gets backed up sometimes. You can file a title inquiry request if you want to escalate it." "And how long would that take?" "About 4 to 6 weeks." "And during that time," Malcolm said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of someone who knew exactly what was being done to him, "what happens if someone tries to file a claim on the land?" The man behind the counter gave a tired shrug. "That's not my department." Malcolm didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply gathered the folder and walked out of the office knowing full well that this wasn't incompetence or coincidence. It was calculated erasure, carried out by people who understood how to bend the law until it broke over the right necks. The question wasn't whether someone had moved against him. It was how many and how far they were willing to go. By the time he returned to the farm, the sun was tilting west, casting long amber shadows across the yard, and the scent of honeysuckle clung to the warm air. His phone buzzed against the passenger seat as he pulled into the gravel drive, and when he saw the unfamiliar number, something instinctual told him to answer. "Mr. Hayes?" came the voice, crisp, professional but unmistakably direct. "This is Latasha King from the South Valley Watch. I believe what's happening to you isn't isolated. And if you're willing to talk, I'd like to show you why." They agreed to meet within the hour. and by the time Malcolm arrived at the small cafe tucked beside the bookstore near the edge of town, she was already seated in a corner booth, her notebook open, a pen tapping thoughtfully against the pages. She was younger than he'd expected, dressed in a gray jacket over a black blouse, her natural curls pulled into a loose bun, and her expression one of quiet intensity, the kind that spoke to long hours and a relentless hunger for truth. "I've been tracking rural land cases for the last 18 months, she began, getting straight to the point as soon as he sat down. "Particularly cases involving black landowners being systematically pressured to sell or lose their land altogether. Your parcel number was flagged on a list I've been monitoring. What's happening to you fits a very familiar pattern." Malcolm listened as she laid it out, how shell companies tied to local officials were quietly acquiring land across 3 counties, how legal loopholes and mysterious code violations were used to pressure families, and how those who didn't comply often found their deeds contested or lost in bureaucratic fog. She showed him photos, elderly couples standing in front of homes they no longer owned, young farmers whose permits were denied without explanation, and satellite images of cleared land now bearing signs for luxury housing developments funded by the same firm listed on the trucks that had appeared on Malcolm's property. "They always start small," Latasha said, flipping through her file. "They push through zoning boards, reclassify land as vacant or under review, and by the time the owner realizes what's happening, it's too late. But your case is unusual, because your grandmother blocked one of these developments years ago. I found court records. Ruth Hayes filed an injunction in 1998 that stopped a subdivision plan dead in its tracks. She was the only one who won. And now they're coming for her land again," Malcolm said quietly, absorbing the full weight of it. Latasha nodded. "And they're doing it carefully. No direct threats, just pressure. Disappearing paperwork. Officials with selective memory. And survey crews pretending a deal's already done." They talked for a long time, not as strangers, but as 2 people who understood the language of loss. The slow erosion of rights, not by violence, but by silence, and the quiet theft of heritage behind locked doors and sealed files. Before they parted, she promised to send him more records, names of other families affected, and contact information for a property lawyer who might be able to help. That evening, as the sky deepened into violet and gold, Malcolm returned home with his thoughts heavy but focused. He parked beside the barn and stepped out into the cooling air, his eyes sweeping the landscape the way his grandmother used to, like he was checking in with the earth itself. He noticed them right away. Fresh tire tracks carved deep into the soil along the western edge of the property. Not on the driveway. Not anywhere near the survey flags. These had come in quietly, circled behind the shed, and vanished into the tree line without disturbing anything else. Someone had been here, and they hadn't come to talk. He walked the length of the trail with Shep at his side, the dog's body tense, ears high, nose to the wind. The air was still, but something lingered in it. A feeling, a presence, the kind of quiet that felt too quiet. Back inside, Malcolm opened his grandmother's desk and pulled out the trail camera she used to set near the chicken coop. He cleaned it, loaded fresh batteries, and mounted it high on a fence post where the tires had turned. As he looked out across the darkening field, past the trees, and into the slow pull of night, he understood that what was coming wasn't going to be fast or loud. It was going to be steady, intentional, and relentless. But so was he. The next morning unfolded with the kind of stillness that never felt quite right. The sun rose behind a haze, softening the outlines of the land, and the bird's song, usually a gentle background chorus, seemed scattered and uncertain. Malcolm was inspecting the camera placement by the shed when he heard the distant crackle of tires again, not on the road this time, but coming up the drive without hesitation. The vehicles weren't farm trucks or maintenance crews. They were law enforcement cruisers, two of them, slow-rolling like they had all the time in the world, and no reason to explain why they were there. He didn't move to meet them. He stayed by the fence post until both men stepped out, their doors left open, radios faintly squawking behind them. Deputy Briggs, the same man who'd smirked at the town hall with a look that belonged more to a man sizing up property than serving it, approached first, chewing gum with an exaggerated casualness that didn't match the steel edge in his walk. Deputy Foster, leaner and quieter, walked a few paces behind, his hands resting near his belt, his gaze scanning the yard with deliberate detachment. "Morning again, Mr. Hayes," Briggs said, as he sauntered forward, his boots crunching softly in the loose gravel. "Heard from the county there's been some new complaints about your fence. Thought we'd stop by and help clear things up." Malcolm didn't flinch. "My fence is where it's always been. You're not here for any complaint." Briggs gave a tight smile and rolled his shoulders back like a man trying to claim the air between them. "Well, I guess that's up to interpretation. Some folks around here think this land's in transition. Boundaries get messy. Title questions, paperwork delays. Figured we'd take a closer look, see where things stand." "You don't get to see anything without a warrant," Malcolm replied calmly, though the stillness in his voice had begun to harden. "And you're trespassing." Briggs stepped in closer, the smile thinning, his face angling just enough that Malcolm could see the glint in his eye. The kind of glint that came from knowing you had a badge and backup, and thought that was all you needed to win. "You ever hear the saying, 'Possession's 9/10 of the law'?" he asked. "Paper don't matter much if no one's around to enforce it." Malcolm took one step forward, not aggressive, just solid, like he was planting himself into the land itself. "This land has a name, and it's not yours." The smile vanished. Briggs moved fast, faster than Malcolm expected, shoving him hard with both hands into the side of the shed. The impact sent a dull reverberation through the sheet metal, and Malcolm stumbled, catching himself against the wall with one hand, pain blooming through his shoulder as the sun flared behind Briggs's silhouette. "You got a smart mouth," Briggs said, stepping in, voice low and close. "And it's gonna get you into trouble out here." Malcolm didn't speak. He pivoted his body, dropped his weight, and twisted away from the shed just as Briggs reached for him again. Years of buried training surfaced without thought. He gripped Briggs's wrist, locked it, and twisted sharply, turning the momentum against him. Briggs grunted in surprise as he stumbled forward, nearly falling. Deputy Foster stepped forward, hand hovering over his holster, but not drawing yet, eyes wide and flicking rapidly between the two men. Then Shep came barreling from the side of the house, barking with a fury that split the air. The dog skidded to a stop just short of the fight, teeth bared, his growl like thunder swelling just beneath the surface. His eyes were locked on Briggs, body lowered in warning, every inch of him radiating tension. "Get your damn dog back," Briggs barked, jerking his arm free and backing away just a step, more startled by the sudden shift in control than any real fear of the animal. "Shep, stay!" Malcolm called out sharply, never taking his eyes off the deputy. The dog didn't move, but his barking didn't stop. He circled slowly, never turning his back, his growl rising and falling like a warning siren held just under restraint. Briggs, flushed and breathing harder now, turned back toward Malcolm with a sneer curling across his face. "You think you're tough?" he hissed. "Think that fancy deed in a mutt gives you the right to put your hands on me?" "You put your hands on me first," Malcolm said, stepping back into the open, his posture loose but ready. "I'm just returning the favor." Briggs lunged, and this time Malcolm didn't step away. He ducked low, caught Briggs's arm again, and drove his forearm into the deputy's torso. The air left Briggs in a hard grunt, but he recovered quickly, swinging a wild right hook that clipped Malcolm's jaw and snapped his head to the side. The pain jolted through him, but it only fueled the adrenaline that surged behind his next move. Tursteeden, he stepped inside the arc of Briggs's next punch, wrapped his arms around the man's midsection, and twisted, driving him backward with his shoulder and slamming him against the fence post behind the shed. The wood cracked under the force, a sharp splintering sound that echoed through the stillness as the entire frame shifted slightly from the impact. Briggs cursed, trying to break free, but Malcolm held firm, adjusting his grip with the quiet precision of someone who wasn't fighting for show or dominance, but for the right to stand where he stood without being moved. With a sharp pivot and a downward shift of weight, Malcolm pulled the man off balance and brought him down into the dirt, dragging him into a controlled roll that raised a cloud of dust into the warm morning air. The two men tumbled hard, fists and elbows striking through instinct and exhaustion. Briggs landed a blow across Malcolm's ribs, and Malcolm countered with a hard shot to the jaw that sent blood arcing from the corner of the deputy's mouth. The punches weren't clean anymore, no longer guided by form or restraint, but driven instead by something more primal. Two bodies locked in the ugliness of a fight that had never really been about fence lines or code violations, but about the weight of history, power, and what happened when a black man dared to say no and refused to move. Briggs surged upward, teeth bared, rage making him clumsy as he swung again, missing wide. Malcolm ducked, came in low, and drove his shoulder into Briggs's midsection, lifting him briefly before slamming him into the side of the shed once more. The tin wall gave a hollow metallic groan, and the old nails popped loose in places as if the building itself recoiled at the sound of violence unfolding beside it. Malcolm stepped back, breathing hard, fists still raised, blood in his mouth, his muscles burning, his heartbeat steady only because he had learned long ago how to keep it that way. Briggs wiped his mouth, spat into the dust, and squared up again, his face flushed red with fury, his breath ragged, but his pride still clawing for ground. Then, from behind the porch, a low, steady growl cut through the rising tension like a blade through rope. Shep emerged slowly, his body low to the ground, eyes locked on Briggs, fur bristling along his spine as the growl deepened, resonating with a warning that needed no translation. The dog didn't lunge. He didn't bark. He simply placed himself between Malcolm and Briggs with a silent authority that left no question about where he stood or what he was willing to do. Briggs froze, one hand drifting toward his belt with a twitch that hadn't yet become action, but was close. Too close. Malcolm didn't move. His voice, though hoarse, remained steady. "Shep, stay." The dog held his position, growling low, body tense, waiting. "Shep, down!" Still, the dog did not retreat. He simply stood his ground, his warning unwavering. Briggs, panting, hands shaking slightly now, flicked his gaze to the dog, then to Malcolm, then back again. "You need to get that mutt out of my face before something happens," he said, though his voice cracked halfway through the sentence, and the threat came out sounding more like fear than authority. Malcolm, his lip bleeding and his ribs aching, kept his eyes on Briggs and didn't move an inch. "Shep's protecting what's his," he said, each word slow and measured. "And he's doing it better than anyone else in this town." Foster stepped in now, finally but cautiously, hands raised, his voice low and coaxing, not directed at Malcolm, but at his partner. "Carl, let's go. It's done." Briggs didn't back away. He reached for his holster. "Shep!" Malcolm called again, louder now, his voice slicing through the air. The dog stayed firm, still not attacking, still not yielding, just growling deeper now, every inch of his posture demanding that the man in front of him leave. And then Briggs drew. The panic overtook him before the sense could. The fear ignited before the brain processed what wasn't a threat, but a stance. The gun cleared leather in a single trembling motion, and in that moment, a decision was made. Not by logic or reason or procedure, but by fear dressed as force. The gun fired once. The shot cracked through the yard, scattering birds into the sky. Shep's growl cut off mid-breath as his body jolted to the side, the bullet hitting just behind his shoulder and driving him down hard into the dust. His legs scrambled for a moment, paws scratching weakly at the ground, then stilled as the blood began to pool beneath him, soaking into the soil that moments earlier he had guarded. The yard fell deathly quiet. Briggs stood there, gun still half raised, expression hollow. Malcolm did not speak. He dropped to his knees beside Shep, gently lifting the dog's head as the last flicker of life ebbed from his body. His fingers trembled, brushing through the fur behind the ears, his mouth opening slightly as if a sound might form, but none did. He pressed a hand over the wound, though he already knew it was too late. There was no bark, no final growl, just warmth fading into stillness and breath giving way to silence. Briggs took a shaky step backward, blinking as if waking from a dream. Foster stood frozen, his mouth open, hands still up. "What did you do?" he asked, not demanding, not angry, just stunned. He moved. He was coming at me," Briggs muttered, but even he didn't sound like he believed the words. Malcolm looked up slowly, not with tears, not with rage, but with something far heavier than either. His face was calm. His eyes were cold. There was no expression, only a gaze that said everything without needing to speak. Foster put a hand on Briggs's arm. "We need to go." Briggs nodded absently, lowering the weapon, stepping back as if trying to shrink into the silence. They turned and walked to the cruiser, the gravel crunching beneath their feet the only sound left. The doors closed, the engine started, and the car reversed down the drive without sirens, without urgency, without even the decency of a glance back. Malcolm remained beside his dog. He stayed there long after the sound of the engine disappeared, his hand still resting on the lifeless body, the blood drying into the ground, the weight of everything pressing into his chest with a silence so complete it felt like the world itself had stopped to bear witness. He didn't move. He didn't cry. He simply watched the earth where his dog had fallen, and understood, with the clarity of grief sharpened into resolve, that the war for this land had only just begun. The earth was dry that morning, the kind of dry that made each shovelful feel heavier than it should, not because of the weight, but because of what it meant to put it down. Malcolm dug with the same strength he had used to build fences, move feed, and clear the fields each season. But this was different. This was not work. This was not duty. This was ritual, carried out with the grim steadiness of a man who understood that there were no words to say, no eulogy to offer, no closure to be found in anything except the movement of his own hands. He buried Shep just beyond the pecan tree near the west side of the property, beneath the same patch of soil where Ruth had once planted wildflowers that came back every spring, even when everything else refused to grow. There was no headstone, just a small wooden marker carved with the dog's name and the year, pressed into the ground with quiet finality. He didn't speak. He didn't cry. The only sound was the scrape of the shovel and the rustle of wind through the tall grass that framed the scene like mourners too solemn to approach. When it was done, Malcolm stood over the fresh mound of soil, the morning sun casting long shadows behind him. He didn't stay long. Grief was not something he wore in front of anyone, not even the land. It had a place, and he had already given it enough. Inside the house, he cleared off Ruth's old kitchen table and began pulling out everything he had stored over the last few weeks. paperwork, receipts, printed emails, a notepad filled with dates and times, all of it spread out like a battlefield waiting to be mapped. Then he moved through the house and the barn, installing cameras. Not the obvious ones that came in shiny boxes and boasted about security, but small, discreet trail cameras with long battery lives and silent triggers. He mounted one inside the shed, just beneath the eave that had caught the light during the fight. Another above the porch, angled low across the drive. Two more along the back fence line, tucked into the bark of the trees, nearly invisible unless someone knew where to look. By the time the sun crossed its highest point, he had covered every angle that mattered. That afternoon, he drove into town and filed a formal complaint at the sheriff's office. The deputy at the front desk took the report with glazed indifference, barely looking up from his monitor as he stamped the form and dropped it into an overflowing tray. "We'll look into it," the deputy said. "I have footage," Malcolm replied. "We'll call you if we need it." He waited 2 full days and heard nothing. On the third, he called Latasha. She came to the farm just before sunset, her car rolling up the gravel path with a slow, deliberate ease that made Malcolm feel like she already knew what had happened before he said a word. He didn't invite her in. He just handed her the flash drive and told her it was time. They sat on the porch while the footage uploaded to her laptop, the screen reflecting the dying light of day across her face. She watched it quietly. No gasps, no curses, just a long, slow nod as the frames moved from confrontation to fight to the soundless recording of Briggs pulling the trigger. There was no audio, but there didn't need to be. The image of the dog falling, of Malcolm collapsing beside him, of the patrol car driving away. It said more than words ever could. "Do you want this out now?" she asked. "Yes," Malcolm said. "But don't post the whole thing." "Just enough." She understood immediately. The point wasn't to spark outrage. Not yet. The point was to signal that he was watching, and that others would soon be watching too. She posted the edited footage to a regional watchdog blog later that night, framing it with a short write-up that named no names but raised the right questions. Within hours, it had been shared across 3 counties and was already being picked up by small networks that liked stories of injustice, but preferred them without names until someone else took the risk first. The next day, Malcolm got a call, not from the sheriff, but from Jeremiah Boone. "I saw the clip," Jeremiah said, his voice low, weighted with something that sounded like shame. "I know someone, a friend of Ruth's. Used to be a civil rights attorney, got pushed out after making too much noise, but he still works when it matters." "What's his name?" "Walter Perrin. Retired. But not retired enough to ignore this." Malcolm agreed to meet him. That same evening, Walter drove out in a dust-coated sedan that coughed when it idled and smelled like old files and worn-out justice. He was a small man with a sharp face and deep-set eyes that had seen too much and stopped blinking because of it. He didn't talk long, just reviewed the footage, nodded once, and told Malcolm exactly what he needed to do. "Don't engage them directly," Walter said. "Document, record, track every point of contact. Get names, get dates. Assume every conversation is something they'll deny later. Write it down anyway." Malcolm listened. He took notes. He asked questions when he didn't understand. And when Walter left, he kept writing. The shift in him wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But it was absolute. He stopped asking if things would get better. He stopped expecting anyone to protect him. He stopped hoping that being right would be enough. From that point forward, everything he did had purpose. He logged every phone call. He photographed every new tire track. He kept receipts for every county visit, requested written confirmations for every permit and record inquiry. He built a wall, not from wood or stone, but from proof. He still walked the land every morning, but now he did it with his phone recording quietly in his back pocket. He still waved at the few neighbors who passed by, but his eyes always followed the direction their cars came from. He still stood by Shep's grave before breakfast, but now the silence there felt less like loss and more like oath. Something inside him had shifted. The Malcolm who arrived to honor his grandmother's will had believed the system, if challenged, would eventually correct itself. The Malcolm who now moved through the house and field with quiet focus understood that there was no system, only people, power, and proof. And he was done asking. The Sunday after the footage leaked, Malcolm sat quietly in the back row of St. Matthew Baptist Church, his hands folded loosely in his lap, and his eyes fixed not on the pulpit, but on the stained-glass window just behind it, the one Ruth had always admired for the way the morning light made the colors dance across the floor like flames too graceful to burn. He had not come for scripture. He had not come for comfort. He had come because he had been invited, by name, by gesture, by a quiet phone call from Deacon Harris, who had said simply, "Your grandmother stood for us. It's our turn now." When the service ended, no one asked him what had happened. No one whispered about the footage. They didn't need to. They had all seen it. They had all known something like this would come eventually, just not when or to whom. As the congregation filtered outside, Deacon Harris clasped Malcolm's hand with both of his, firm and warm, his voice low but resolute. "You don't fight this alone," he said. "Not while we're still standing." By the following week, church members had started showing up in small ways, quiet, unannounced acts of solidarity that didn't require thanks. One man brought spare lumber and helped Malcolm reinforce the section of fence that had been pulled apart during the night. A woman from the choir delivered a box of pantry goods and left it on the porch with a simple note that read, "For strength." Another neighbor loaned him a trail camera he no longer used. They didn't all speak of justice, but their actions spoke clearly of community. And then came the surprise. One morning, Malcolm walked out to check the property line and found a small group of volunteers already working along the ditch. Two of them were black men from the church. One was a young white teacher from town, and the last was an older white man in denim coveralls who said only, "Ruth once helped my sister keep her home. This is overdue." Not everyone who watched approved. A few passing trucks slowed, then sped off. One man shouted something from the road that Malcolm didn't catch, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that when he turned around, no one had left. They kept working. While the support grew quietly around him, Latasha was digging deeper. She returned to the farm one afternoon with a manila envelope under her arm, her expression tight and serious, in a way that told Malcolm whatever she had found wasn't just relevant, it was damning. They sat again on the porch, same as before, the sun creeping low behind the trees as she unfolded a printed spreadsheet, its rows highlighted in yellow and red. "This is a list of properties seized through emergency redevelopment statutes in the last 10 years, she said. They were labeled as blighted or underutilized, then reassigned to third-party contractors for revitalization. Every one of those third parties ties back to a holding company called East Pine Consolidated. Want to guess who sits on their board?" Malcolm didn't speak. Latasha answered anyway. "Mayor Howard Renshaw. Technically, he resigned from the board when he ran for office, but the company's current director is his cousin. Another member is his former campaign manager. The money moves in a circle, and the town feeds the wheel." She passed him a second sheet. Printouts of title records, shell company filings, and minutes from zoning board meetings. "They've been doing this quietly, one parcel at a time. Your grandmother stopped them once when they tried to seize 3 lots outside of Bell's Crossing. Blocked it with a last-minute injunction. Saved 2 of the owners. One of them was Jeremiah Boone." Malcolm looked up, his jaw tightening slightly. "He never told me that. He didn't want to." Latasha said, but he confirmed it when I asked. That evening, Malcolm sat with Jeremiah by the shed as the last light drained from the sky. The older man didn't avoid the conversation. He didn't justify the omission. He simply nodded, his eyes shadowed beneath the brim of his cap. "They came for my land same way they're coming for yours," he said. "Claimed it was unincorporated, vulnerable to reclassification. Ruth found a clerical flaw in their paperwork, exposed it just in time. If she hadn't—" He trailed off, then rubbed his palms together like trying to wash off the memory. "I should have told you. I figured if you didn't ask, maybe you didn't need the burden." "I needed the truth," Malcolm replied. Jeremiah nodded again. "You've got it now." The days that followed were less quiet. Malcolm began to notice the shift, not loud or overt, but constant. A drone passed overhead twice in one day, hovering just long enough to make itself known, then drifting off without ever dipping low enough to identify. Each night, around the same time, an engine roared past the edge of the property, headlights off, tires kicking up gravel. On the fourth night, he found the northeast corner of the fence torn down again, this time with boot prints stamped clearly into the soil around the splintered posts. He didn't call the sheriff. He repaired the fence. He logged the time. He uploaded the footage. He didn't flinch. By now, he understood the rhythm of intimidation, the way it crept in like mold, slow and persistent, softening the edges of a man's resolve until things broke where they once held. But what they hadn't accounted for, what Renshaw and Briggs and whoever else stood behind their quiet siege had failed to calculate, was that Malcolm wasn't standing alone. Every subtle threat was now met with a countermeasure. Every scare tactic was documented. Every trespass was recorded and archived. And through it all, something inside him had settled, not as a fire, not as rage, but as a kind of unshakable calm that came from knowing what he was fighting, and why he could no longer afford to lose. The dream came just before dawn, carried not on fear or memory, but on something deeper, something older than grief and stronger than guilt. In it, Malcolm was a boy again, no more than 10, standing barefoot in the middle of the field behind the house, the earth warm and soft beneath his feet, the air heavy with the scent of turned soil and honeysuckle. The pecan tree stood taller than he remembered, casting a wide shadow that stretched toward the horizon. And under that tree, as real as the sun above them, sat Ruth Hayes in her rocking chair, her hands resting lightly in her lap, her gaze steady and bright. She didn't speak at first. She didn't need to. Malcolm approached, slower than the wind, feeling the pull of something he couldn't name, but had always known was there. He reached out, but she shook her head gently, not to stop him, but to guide him. "You can't hold on to what's already gone," she said, her voice exactly as he remembered, clear, calm, unhurried. "But you can stand for what's still yours." He opened his mouth to reply, but the words didn't come. He didn't need them. She pointed toward the horizon, where the field stretched long and golden, and her voice softened to a whisper that seemed to rise from the land itself. "They'll try to take it from you. Not just with paper and lies, but with fear. Don't you ever bow to fear, Malcolm. Not here. Not on our ground." When he woke, the light had barely broken over the hills. The house was quiet, the room still, but the words were with him, lingering like the dust that always settled after something sacred had passed through. By mid-morning, Latasha had called twice and sent a message that simply said, "Call me." Now! When he reached her, her voice shook with restrained anger, but it was controlled, every word clipped by urgency. "Someone ran me off the road last night." Malcolm stopped pacing the porch, his hand tightening around the phone. "Are you hurt?" "No, but I should be," she said. They followed me from the south edge of town, got up close, tried to sideswipe me near the curve before the bridge. I swerved and hit the ditch. No damage, just scared the hell out of me. You think it was a warning? I know it was. I just published the follow-up piece, linked the shell companies to East Pine, called out the zoning board, not by name, but close enough to rattle them. 30 minutes later, I'm driving home, and suddenly there's a truck riding my bumper like it wants to climb through the window. License plate? Too dark. No cameras nearby. Nothing we can prove. There was a long pause between them, filled only by the low hum of static and the sound of Malcolm's own breathing as he stared across the fields with eyes that no longer looked for peace, but for patterns. They're desperate, she said at last. That's the only reason they'd come for me like that. You're getting too close, Malcolm. They're scared. They should be. Later that afternoon, he found the brick. It was lodged beneath a broken rafter on the east side of the barn, surrounded by shattered glass from the window it had traveled through. The message painted in white across the brick was crude and jagged, the kind of thing written in a hand that didn't care about legibility, only delivery. You don't belong. He stared at it for a long time, not because he was afraid, but because he had never needed a reminder that he was being watched. The message didn't frighten him. It confirmed what he already knew. But it was the fact they had entered the barn that stayed with him. That night, he uploaded more footage. Not just of the attack, not just of the shooting, but everything. The illegal surveying, the forced fight, the intimidation, the trespass, the drone flyovers, and now the vandalism. He narrated nothing. He offered no monologue, no dramatic music, no pleas. Just timestamps, coordinates, and clear visuals of what was happening on the land his grandmother had died believing was safe. He sent it to every major outlet in the region, from local newspapers to regional watchdog groups to national rural justice networks. Most didn't respond. 2 local news stations emailed him with polite dismissals, citing legal concerns, editorial priorities, or the need for further confirmation. One anchor even suggested that perhaps Malcolm's military background had influenced his interpretation of events. But one outlet did respond. The South Gulf Free Chronicle, an independent paper based 3 states away, published the entire collection with a long-form investigation written by Latasha, who had quietly been preparing the piece in anticipation of the day Malcolm would finally say yes. Within hours, the story had been picked up by several regional networks and shared across online justice forums, rural land rights groups, and independent watchdog sites. The footage of Briggs firing the shot, combined with the coordinated documentation of property intimidation and legal obstruction, drew immediate attention from activists and civil rights lawyers across the state. Malcolm watched it unfold from the porch, his laptop open beside him, the steady flow of comments, messages, and pings creating a rhythm that felt almost like breath. Not relief, not vindication, just motion, just movement forward. He didn't smile. He didn't relax. He just turned his eyes toward the fence line that had been broken twice in the last week and watched the wind bend through the tall grass beyond it. It began with a loose floorboard beneath Ruth's bed, the kind Malcolm had stepped over for years without ever noticing the slight rise in the grain or the faint creak it gave when weight pressed down just right. He wasn't looking for anything when he found it, just shifting the old frame to clean beneath it, the way Ruth always insisted things be done properly, even when no one was watching. But when the edge of the board lifted beneath his boot and revealed a slim hollow packed with oilskin and dust, he knew instinctively that whatever was hidden there hadn't been meant for casual discovery. The bundle inside was wrapped in layers of waxed cloth, tied with twine, and sealed inside an old manila envelope marked with nothing but a faded black X. He carried it to the kitchen table and opened it with care, his hands slow, deliberate, as though the weight of what he was about to read had already begun pressing into his chest. Inside were deeds, old ones, handwritten in ink that had browned with age, stamped with seals from a time before digital records had replaced ink and paper. Some bore Ruth's name. Others, older, listed names Malcolm didn't recognize: Thomas Boone, William Akers, Gloria Hammond. Several had small handwritten notes in the margins in Ruth's careful script. Contested 1979. Filed, then revoked. Title transferred under duress. There were correspondences, too. Letters exchanged with lawyers, scanned copies of property boundary disputes, and several legal notices addressed not to Ruth, but to a Mr. Levi Hayes, Malcolm's great-grandfather. Many were stamped with the insignia of the mayor's office or the town zoning committee. Others were from names he had never seen before, though one caught his eye almost immediately: Franklin Carr. Near the bottom of the stack was a letter, unfinished, written in Ruth's handwriting on thick, lined stationery. The first lines were composed with her usual steady hand, but the writing grew faint and uncertain near the end, trailing off mid-sentence like a breath interrupted. "Malcolm, if you ever meet Franklin Carr." That was all it said. No context, no explanation. Just that single name hanging in the silence like a match held over dry grass. He stared at the page for a long time, fingers resting lightly on the paper, trying to imagine what she had intended to say and why she had stopped. He called Latasha that evening, and within hours she had begun combing through old civic directories and whistleblower records. It didn't take long for her to call back. "Franklin Carr," she said. Her voice clipped, as though she already knew the weight of what she was about to deliver. "Used to be a senior city planner, oversaw rezoning and land audits during the late 90s. Filed a sealed complaint in 2003 about fraudulent land transfers. Went missing 4 months later. Officially retired early, but no exit records, no forwarding address. His house was sold off by the bank after foreclosure. No confirmed sightings since. Disappeared? Or made to disappear?" The line stayed quiet for a moment, both of them thinking the same thing without needing to say it. Ruth had known about him. She had written his name and then stopped herself, not because she forgot, but because even writing it had been a risk. Malcolm didn't sleep that night. The next morning, he found Jeremiah waiting for him by the gate, leaning against the post with his arms folded and his face carved from something tighter than concern. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. "I heard you've been digging," Jeremiah said without preamble. "I found something Ruth left behind," Malcolm replied evenly. "She was tracking something for years. I think I'm supposed to finish it." Jeremiah shook his head slowly. "You're supposed to protect the land, not get buried in the past." "I'm doing both." Jeremiah's eyes narrowed, and for the first time since they met, there was distance in his tone, an edge Malcolm hadn't heard before. "There's history in this town that doesn't want remembering," he said. "Some things don't rest easy, and some people, if you pull the wrong threads, you won't like what unravels." Malcolm waited for more, but none came. Jeremiah simply turned and walked back down the road, shoulders set, back straight. The conversation closed behind him like a door meant to stay shut. Later that day, Malcolm sat with Walter Perrin at the kitchen table, the two of them leaning over a spread of old town maps Latasha had found in the county archives. The maps were decades old, marked in red and green lines, some drawn by hand, others typed and stamped. But one detail stopped them both cold. Malcolm's land, Ruth's land, wasn't always private property. On a 1956 zoning map, the parcel was labeled TWP Reserve 04, listed under town jurisdiction as public development space. No transfer, no sale, no listed acquisition. By 1962, It had been reclassified as private. No listed owner, just the plot boundaries redrawn and relabeled. "There's no legal paper trail," Walter murmured, frowning. "It's like it was moved off the books, then re-added later, but to a different name. That's not just an error. That's design." Malcolm sat back slowly, the implications washing over him like a cold wind. "It wasn't Ruth's to begin with," he said quietly. "She must have known." Walter nodded. "And she fought to protect it anyway. Because by the time they realized what she'd done, she had already made it hers." Malcolm folded the map and stared at the wall, where Ruth's portrait hung above the mantel, her expression proud, strong, unreadable. He understood now what Jeremiah had meant. Ruth hadn't just owned the land. She had taken it back, piece by piece, from people who had tried to keep it hidden, to erase its value, to keep it out of hands like hers. And now they were trying to erase it again. But this time, the paper trail was exposed, and the patterns were clearer. The same players, or their successors, were using the same tactics. Different language, cleaner filings, but the same slow violence. Ruth had known it would return. That's why she left pieces behind. Not enough to explain everything, but just enough for someone willing to see what had been concealed in plain sight. That night, Malcolm sat at the kitchen table with the unfinished letter. He read the last line again, tracing the ink with his finger as if the act might summon the words Ruth had never written. "If you ever meet Franklin Carr." It was a name without context, a door without a key, and yet it was clear she had meant it to be found. Latasha arrived the next morning with her laptop and a look that left no doubt she had been up most of the night. Her voice was low, focused, as she pulled up a series of linked documents and a property ledger buried in a neglected state archive. "I think I found him," she said. The man known as Franklin Carr had disappeared from public records in 2003, 2 months after filing a sealed complaint against the city's redevelopment commission. But someone matching his description had resurfaced under a different name, Eldon Ray, living on the edge of a remote parish in southern Louisiana, where the roads narrowed into gravel and the trees grew thick enough to hide almost anything. There were no photos, no phone number, no formal employment, just an address and a set of utility bills that hadn't changed in over a decade. Malcolm didn't hesitate. He, Latasha, and Walter left the next day, crossing state lines with a file full of Ruth's documents and the weight of questions that had waited long enough for answers. The road wound slowly through bayou country, where cypress trees leaned over narrow bridges, and the stillness seemed to hang in the air like judgment. By late afternoon, they turned onto a dirt lane that led to a low house shaded by moss-draped oaks. There were no cars out front. No sound except the wind through the trees. Malcolm knocked once. When the door opened, the man who stood on the other side looked at each of them in turn, his posture guarded, but not hostile. He was thin, older than Ruth would have been, with skin weathered by years of sun and silence. Behind his glasses, his eyes flicked to the folder in Malcolm's hand, then back to his face. "How'd you find me?" he asked, his voice quiet, even. "Ruth Hayes," Malcolm replied. The man didn't flinch. He didn't move. But the name settled between them like an old truth returning. "Come in," he said. The house smelled faintly of tobacco and paper. Legal pads were stacked beside a rusted typewriter, and rolled maps lined one wall, their edges curled from time. He didn't offer his name. He didn't ask for theirs. He simply motioned toward the table, where a mug of cold coffee sat next to a box labeled TWP Archives. "I knew someone would come eventually," he said. "Didn't think it'd take this long." Malcolm placed Ruth's documents on the table without speaking. He waited. The man opened the folder and leafed through the records with care, pausing at the letter Ruth had started. His hand stopped on the line that bore his name, and for the first time his voice cracked slightly. Not with sadness, but memory. "I was Franklin Carr," he said, "before it got too dangerous to be." He didn't pace his story for effect. He spoke plainly, like someone laying bricks, one truth at a time. He had been a senior zoning officer for the town and its neighboring counties, responsible for reconciling property lines and cataloging underutilized parcels. At first, the anomalies had been small: missing notations, overwritten ownership codes, title inconsistencies that were dismissed as clerical errors. But the pattern grew, and the pattern pointed in one direction. Black-owned land was being marked as vacant, Carr said. Families that still lived there were suddenly listed as unreachable or non-compliant. Then those parcels would transfer, quietly, cleanly, to holding companies with no street addresses. He had filed a complaint. And then he had vanished. "A break-in took out my records. My pension was suspended pending review. My house got a visit. After that, I stopped being Franklin Carr." He stood slowly and walked to a bookshelf near the back of the room. From behind a stack of zoning manuals, he retrieved a thin folder marked only with the initials RH. He set it on the table and opened it, revealing maps, annotations, and a list of names Malcolm recognized, some from Ruth's files, some from the town's past. "She found me years later," Carr said. "Didn't ask for help. She asked for confirmation. She already knew what they'd done. She just needed proof. And you gave it to her," Walter said quietly. Carr nodded. "She used it to start restoring titles. Quietly. Carefully. Only the ones she could verify. She never made it public. Never exposed names. She knew it would put targets on the families." Malcolm looked through the papers, past deeds and annotations, until he came to a list of municipal employees who had processed the transfers. The fifth name on the list stopped him cold: Jeremiah Boone. Carr didn't look surprised when he saw Malcolm's reaction. "He worked in the records office when this started," Carr said. "He signed off on several of the early reclassifications. Said he didn't know what he was doing at first. Maybe he didn't. But he kept doing it." Malcolm leaned back, the breath leaving his chest, not in shock, but in quiet confirmation. He remembered Jeremiah's silence, the way his eyes shifted when certain topics came too close. It hadn't been fear. It had been shame. Ruth had known. She had protected him anyway, but she hadn't trusted him with everything. Latasha's eyes narrowed. And now... Carr closed the folder. "Now he's lying low, same as the others. He'll pretend not to know. He'll say he was just a clerk. But Ruth left you that list for a reason." Malcolm stood, the folder in his hand, and nodded once. Not as farewell, but as acknowledgement. Then it's time someone finally said the names out loud. Malcolm didn't go to Jeremiah's house right away. He waited until the sky turned that bruised blue between dusk and dark, when the light softened and the world held its breath. It was the hour Ruth had always chosen to walk her fence line, quiet and watchful, when the land seemed to listen best. Now, with the folder from Carr tucked under his arm and the names inside it seared into memory, Malcolm followed that instinct and walked the long path into town, each step steady, each breath measured. Not out of anger, out of clarity. He found Jeremiah sitting on his porch, the same as always, the same chair, the same stillness, his face lit by the flickering amber of a kerosene lamp. The air between them held the weight of something long overdue. Jeremiah looked up, his eyes already heavy with knowing. He didn't greet Malcolm. He didn't smile. He just moved the lamp aside and waited. Malcolm stood at the edge of the porch, the file still in his hand, but he didn't open it. He didn't need to. He had brought it only as proof, not for Jeremiah, but for himself. "You worked in the assessor's office in 1986, Malcolm said, his voice low, unwavering. "You processed a title shift for a 12-acre parcel east of Old County Line. It was supposed to be reclassified for agricultural use. Jeremiah looked away, his gaze resting somewhere beyond the tree line. Malcolm continued. But it wasn't agricultural. It was Ruth's. And it was already paid off. The shift was fraud. And your name is on the file. For a moment, Jeremiah said nothing. The wind rustled through the dry leaves overhead, and a single cicada started to sing from somewhere in the trees. "I know," he said finally. The words didn't surprise Malcolm, but they didn't soften the blow either. "I asked you about this," Malcolm said, "and you told me not to dig. I told you that because I knew what was buried." Malcolm stepped onto the porch, slowly, his boots silent against the wood. "How deep does it go?" he asked. "How long were you part of it?" Jeremiah exhaled through his nose, the kind of breath that carries years of held weight. "I was 27 when Renshaw's father ran zoning," he said. "He came into that office like he already owned the land and the paper it was written on. They called it modernization, clearing up boundaries, merging lots, speeding up development. But it wasn't about efficiency, it was about ownership. And most of the land they wanted was owned by families who didn't have lawyers. Families like yours. And you helped them take it." Jeremiah didn't flinch. "I stamped the files. I adjusted lot lines. They told me it was temporary, just holding until the deeds were corrected. They gave me bonuses, pulled me into quiet meetings, said it was the future of the county. And you believed them?" "I didn't question it. Not at first. I wanted the job. I wanted to stay in the room." Malcolm looked at the man who had once spoken like a guardian of memory, the keeper of Ruth's stories, and he saw now not a traitor, but a coward, someone who had chosen silence at a cost that could never be undone. Jeremiah looked down at his hands, calloused and still. "Ruth found out 2 years later," he said. "She came into that office with receipts, aerial photographs, witness statements. She laid it all out. No threats, no shouting, just proof. The parcel they tried to steal from her had already been promised to Renshaw's father for a private acquisition. No public record, no zoning request, just a handshake deal between two men who thought no one would look twice." Malcolm's grip tightened on the file. She reversed the whole thing with one hearing. One hearing, and she made them blink. After that, they came after her quiet. Code violations, delays, re-inspections. But she never left. "And you?" Malcolm asked. "What did you do after she exposed them?" Jeremiah's voice lowered. "I left the office, took early retirement. I didn't fight. I didn't speak. But I stayed close. I helped where I could. Quietly. I ran errands. Filed her forms when she couldn't. Looked out for her when the pressure came. I did what I could." Malcolm stepped closer. "You did it out of guilt." Jeremiah nodded once. "And out of respect. But I never told her everything, and I never admitted what I signed. I didn't have the courage. You let me believe you were on our side. I wanted to be," he said. "But the truth is, I was trying to atone for something I helped build." Malcolm stood still, staring at him through the dark. "All this time," he said. "All the warnings, all the silence. You weren't trying to protect me. You were trying to keep yourself from being dragged down with them." Jeremiah didn't argue. "I owed Ruth. I owe you. But I was never the one to fix this. I couldn't be." Malcolm turned, stepping back down onto the grass, the file still closed. The questions answered, but the damage freshly exposed. The man who had stood beside his grandmother all those years, the one who helped rebuild her fences and delivered quiet advice, had never been her ally in the full sense, only her penance. "Then stay out of my way," Malcolm said, "because I don't owe anyone." He walked back down the road as the night deepened behind him, each step steadier than the last. The trust he had carried, however fragile, was gone. And in its place, something sharper had taken root. Not just resolve, but clarity. Whatever came next, he would meet it without illusion, without asking, without permission. The truth had already been buried once. It would not be buried again. The article dropped on a Wednesday morning without ceremony, without promotion, and without apology. Latasha published the story in full: documents, footage, whistleblower testimony, and scanned handwritten letters from Ruth's collection, each one layered with evidence that spanned generations of theft disguised as development, property records, reclassified zoning maps, photos of forged deeds, video of Malcolm being shoved against the shed, of Shep's body crumpling to the dirt after the shot, blood soaking into the same ground they had tried to seize. It was a record of not just one theft, but a pattern, a quiet, calculated dismantling of ownership, dignity, and history. And now, it was out in the open. Within hours, it spread, first through independent journalism sites, then through civil rights forums. By that evening, a national outlet had picked it up with a headline that said everything in just a few words: "Buried in plain sight. The war to reclaim stolen black land." The media came quickly after that. News vans lined the gravel road outside Malcolm's gate. Journalists hovered with cameras near his porch, some calling through screens with offers to amplify the story, as if it hadn't already spoken for itself. Malcolm didn't answer. He watched from the same window where Ruth used to pour coffee before sunrise, his hands folded quietly against the sill, Shep's empty collar resting on the windowsill beside him. The next morning, a black government-issued sedan appeared just after sunrise. There were no sirens, no flashing lights, just a clean badge, a quiet knock, and a man in a tailored jacket who introduced himself as Agent Mark Shelby from the State Division of Municipal Oversight. He wasn't there to ask what happened. He was there because he already knew. Shelby confirmed that a preliminary investigation had been opened weeks ago after Latasha's initial records request, but the full story, combined with Carr's testimony and the footage, had triggered something larger. The file was now part of a multi-county audit on land transfers. Malcolm's name was at the top, not as a suspect, but as a turning point. Later that day, subpoenas began arriving. Briggs was placed on immediate leave. Foster was summoned to give a recorded deposition. And it was there, behind closed doors, under the pressure of full immunity for cooperation, that Foster confessed. He didn't stall. He didn't protect his partner. He laid it out clearly. For years, deputies had been instructed to monitor families on old farmland, document movement, issue citations, report anything that could create pressure. The orders weren't written. They came through hallway conversations from city aides and zoning officials who made sure nothing ever made it into email or onto tape. And then, voice low and hands still, Foster told them what happened that day by the shed. He described the fight, the escalation, the dog, the fear, and the shot. "It was wrong," he said. "We knew it the second it happened." He confirmed what the footage already showed, that Malcolm had never been the aggressor, that the dog had never attacked, that Briggs had fired out of panic, and that afterward they had left without reporting the incident, hoping the silence would bury the bullet. That evening, Renshaw attempted damage control. He called an emergency council meeting and proposed a sweeping ordinance framed as a zoning emergency, citing the rising threat of misinformation and the unregulated press. At its core, it gave the city temporary authority to seize disputed property under rapid blight review, an ordinance so vaguely worded it could be turned against anyone. But no one missed the desperation behind it. 2 nights later, the town hall reached capacity long before the meeting started. Folding chairs were pushed into corners. Residents stood shoulder to shoulder against the walls, some holding printed copies of the article, others with arms crossed, waiting. Renshaw sat at the front with his attorneys, their faces drawn, flanked by members of the board who now whispered among themselves instead of backing him outright. Malcolm arrived late. He walked in alone, without press, without legal counsel, wearing the same clean shirt he had worn to Ruth's burial and the same boots he had worn to dig Shep's grave. The room fell quiet as he stepped to the podium. There was no speech prepared. He didn't need one. "My grandmother fought to protect that land for decades," he said, voice calm, but heavy with the weight of everything that had happened. "She planted roots that stretched deeper than the deeds they tried to fake. And now you all know why." He let that settle before continuing. "They tried to erase her. They tried to erase me. They sent men to my home. They pushed me against my own shed. They killed my dog." At that, the air changed. Malcolm didn't raise his voice, but something in the room shifted. Guilt, discomfort, shame, maybe even a ripple of grief. Shep was more than a dog. He was a protector. He stood between me and a badge that forgot what it meant. And for that, he was shot. No charges were filed. No report was made. Just a shovel and a hole and silence. He paused, and the silence that followed was deep enough to carry the truth across the entire room. "I don't want revenge," he said. "I want justice." Someone near the back murmured agreement. Others nodded. The divide was still there, some unwilling to look him in the eye, others staring at him with the quiet ache of those finally seeing what had always been around them. But the truth, now spoken aloud in the place where silence had once ruled, could no longer be denied. When Malcolm stepped away from the podium, he passed Renshaw without a word. The mayor didn't look at him. Outside, the wind swept across the fields, through the cracked fences, past the corner where Shep had stood his ground, and across the patch of earth where Ruth once said the soil remembered everything. And now, so did the world. The indictments came quietly, like most reckonings do, not with sirens or standoffs, but with sealed documents, federal seals, and names that had long believed themselves untouchable, typed in bold across the top of the page. Sheriff Rusk and Mayor Howard Renshaw were charged with conspiracy to defraud, land title manipulation, abuse of power, and systemic intimidation. The list of allegations reading less like legal jargon and more like an autopsy of everything Ruth had fought to keep alive. The charges reached back decades: falsified transfers, unlawful citations, code enforcement weaponized against specific families, and backroom deals designed to push ownership from black hands into corporate ones under the pretense of revitalization. Renshaw, who had once ruled council meetings with unchecked arrogance, now sat behind glass, his suit wrinkled, his voice low and unsure. Sheriff Rusk, no longer shielded by the badge he had used to orchestrate fear, was escorted into the courthouse under federal supervision. Eyes cast downward, his words no longer useful. Deputy Briggs was arrested 3 days later at his brother-in-law's garage. He didn't resist. He didn't speak. The footage of the incident with Malcolm had already spread across state lines, dissected frame by legal analysts and civil rights advocates alike. The charge: unlawful use of force with intent to intimidate. The evidence was irrefutable. His silence now, in the face of the courtroom, echoed louder than the gunshot that had taken Shep's life. But it was Jeremiah's decision that carried the deepest ache. He arrived at the courthouse alone, wearing a pressed shirt and an old tie that looked as though it had been sitting in the back of a drawer since the day he left the assessor's office. He walked past reporters, past the growing crowds, and into the clerk's office with a manila envelope under one arm and a folded letter in the other. His confession was clear, dated, and signed. He admitted to facilitating unlawful reclassifications under direct pressure from then-zoning chair Renshaw Sr., confirming that families had been targeted based on land location, political silence, and perceived legal vulnerability. He acknowledged signing off on dozens of forged boundary realignments and title transfers, including the initial attempt to remove Ruth Hayes from her land. But his final act wasn't just to expose himself. It was to exonerate Ruth fully and formally, leaving behind a sworn affidavit that declared her innocent of all past suspicions, framing her instead as the woman who had uncovered everything and paid the price for telling the truth too early, too clearly, and for too long. The affidavit was added to the case file. Her name was cleared in full. And for the first time since her burial, Malcolm felt like her voice had been restored, not just in memory, but in the law. The civil hearing followed weeks later. With Walter at his side and state officials reviewing every inch of land history from decades past, Malcolm filed for and won a permanent injunction protecting the entirety of the Hayes property from seizure, condemnation, or forced development. The ruling included provisions recognizing the land as historically significant, citing the documented abuse of power and the role Ruth had played in reversing systemic theft across multiple families. In the courtroom that day, when the gavel fell, there was no applause, just stillness. Malcolm didn't speak. He just looked down at the deed now reissued in full, Ruth's name restored as legal precedent, and knew there was nothing left to prove. Back on the land, the restoration began. Not with crews or contractors, but with neighbors, church members, and families whose names had once sat beside Ruth's in dusty files marked pending review. Together, they rebuilt the fence that had been torn down again and again, each post driven deep into the earth with hands that had earned the right to hold the future. They painted the shed where Malcolm had once been thrown. They cleared the fields. They repaired what had been left to rot by those who believed silence would win. And when it was done, Malcolm stood at the edge of the field, watching the wind sweep through the tall grass, the sun casting long golden lines across the land his grandmother had once protected with nothing but willpower and truth. He didn't speak to the cameras. He didn't rehearse a speech. He placed Shep's collar beneath the new gate post, nailed in clean and level, and ran his hand along the rail like Ruth had done on spring mornings when she was checking for loose nails and cracked wood. Trucks arrived at the edge of the fields, not with threats or orders, but with seedlings, tools, and crates of supplies. Some came from the church, some from families Ruth had once helped. Others came quietly, former skeptics who now saw something worth standing beside. Black and white neighbors worked together without ceremony, breaking ground not for profit or sale, but for restoration. Tomatoes, collards, squash, a shared garden, a shared future. Malcolm didn't lead with orders. He led by example. Shovel in hand, sleeves rolled, his boots sunk deep in the dirt beside them. His presence was steady, like the land itself. The same ground where Shep had run. The same soil Ruth had refused to give. Later that week, a state senator arrived, flanked by aides and press, standing just inside the newly painted fence as she addressed the growing crowd. Because of this community, and because of Ruth Hayes and her grandson, new land reform legislation will move forward this fall. No more blind transfers. No more loopholes. No more silence. She handed Malcolm a copy of the proposed bill. It didn't have Ruth's name on it yet, but it would. Children ran past them moments later, their laughter cutting across the open field like music long overdue. Some of them carried watering cans. Others chased each other through furrows that had once been surveyed by men who saw only profit. Now, those rows would grow again, not just food, but proof. Malcolm watched them, arms crossed, eyes calm. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. As the sun dipped lower, the camera pulled back slowly, lifting above the fields, above the workers, the children, the house and barn, showing all of it, the land, still standing, still growing, still Black-owned. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.